President, I indicate my strong support for the motion that's been brought by Mr Mark Pearson, which seeks to put on the record squarely, properly and effectively what should be the unanimous condemnation of members of this House of the appalling history of child sexual abuse within the Catholic Church. For decades and decades and decades, people in positions of authority, both within the Church and within this Parliament, within our police forces, within civic society, knew about child sexual abuse happening in the Catholic Church. They knew about it because survivors had told them. Some of them knew about it because their family members had told them. Others knew about it because in their positions as either an MP or a police officer or as a local mayor had had survivors or the family members of victims who had taken their lives, or just the distraught family members of victims who came begging for help. They'd had the stories and the accounts told to them about the child abuse that was happening within the Catholic Church and by members of the Catholic Church. And for decades and decades and decades, people in positions of authority shut their ears to the victims and bowed down to what they perceived as the political power and the authority of the Catholic Church. Well, it ends now. And it should end now with the unanimous support by this chamber of what is an extremely timely motion being moved by Mr Mark Pearson. It must end now. We need to not just have the stories told in the newspapers about the appalling abuse that has happened in the Catholic Church, recycling the traumatic incidents and the terrible statistics that are being recited by the Royal Commission, and I absolutely commend that organisation for its courageous and unflagging work to support survivors and hold abusive institutions to account.
And the PM who set it up.
But I want to make clear the next steps. The next steps are required to be taken by politicians, by parliaments and by the authorities, not just in New South Wales but across Australia. We need to move rapidly to establish a comprehensive and fair compensation scheme for victims. We need to move rapidly to remove the archaic protections that exist for the Catholic Church so that its assets are treated as more precious than the children it abused. We need to remove the trust structures that hide the Catholic Church's assets from victims. We need to remove the diplomatic protection that the Catholic Church has used to avoid accountability, to avoid producing key documents to the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission, in its opening of the most recent round of hearings against the Catholic Church, made it very clear that the diplomatic protections that the Australian government has given the Catholic Church, and as recently as 1973 by the Gough Whitlam administration, the Vatican was recognised as a pretend nation state and granted all of the diplomatic protections that are normally only afforded to nation states. It's a recent and offensive development in our public law. We need to rescind that protection, that special protection that is only handed to one religious organisation on the planet. Imagine for 1 minute if a politician suggested granting diplomatic recognition to the religion of, say, Sunni Islam or Scientology or the Anglican Church. There would be outrage, and quite rightly outrage. But for some reason, politicians, political leaders, authority figures in this state and this country think it is perfectly okay for the Catholic Church to be given special protections, which we know they abuse. Because when the Royal Commission demanded of the Catholic Church, through their ambassador, which goes by the archaic title of the Apostolic Nuncio in Australia, when they demanded, or actually they had to politely request, when they politely requested all of the records from the Catholic Church and the Vatican about the child sexual abuse complaints that they had received and the systematic responses that they had taken to the child sexual abuse claims. What did the Vatican say? Well, they gave a little dribble of documents initially, and then they said words to the effect, "This is not the way you deal with a nation state. We are refusing to produce these documents. We think your demands are unreasonable." Well, I tell you what the general public in Australia thinks is unreasonable. The general public thinks it is grossly unreasonable. Indeed, it is complicity. It is complicit with an abusive institution to allow it to hide behind diplomatic protections to avoid producing the documents that show the extent of its culpability and the manner in which it failed to respond to the claims of thousands and thousands and thousands of children and victims of abuse. We need to remove the diplomatic protections. We need to be able to subpoena the documents directly from the office of the Apostolic Nuncio. If they won't produce it voluntarily, our law must supersede whatever religious niceties the Catholic Church thinks is more important, and if they won't give the documents voluntarily, we should be able to send in the AFP and produce the documents by force if necessary. Children and victims must always come before the organisations and institutions that abuse them. What do we know? What do we know from the most recent set of figures from the Royal Commission? Well, we know this, that a survey of some 4,444 incidents of abuse between January 1980 and February 2015 by the Royal Commission found that 60% of survivors who attended those Royal Commission sessions reported sexual abuse at faith-based organisations. 60%. But then if we look to the extent to which it was the Catholic Church, we find that almost 2/3 of those who reported abuse in faith-based institutions reported abuse at Catholic institutions. And of the 1,880 alleged perpetrators from within the Catholic Church, 572, just imagine that. Imagine a line of 572 priests. And that's the extent of the reported abuse just against the Catholic Church. 572 priests of the 1,880. But of course it's not just priests. And I'll detail the figures about the orders and the other elements of the Church that were involved and known to be involved in child sexual abuse. And who are we talking about as the victims? Sometimes when we talk about the institutions and we talk about child sexual abuse, it's kind of in the abstract. You know, the child sexual abuse, crimes, churches, priests. But who were the victims? Well, the average age of the victims, the children who were abused in these institutions, was the age of 10 for the girls who were the subject of child sexual abuse. That's the average age. Obviously many younger, many older, but the average age for the girls was 10 and the average age for the boys was 11. Who should we be worried about here? Some nicety for the Catholic Church, some alleged infelicity of language in the motion, or should we be standing up for those 10 and 11-year-old boys and girls who suffered abuse? Of course we should always stand with the victims, unambiguously, strongly, forthrightly. And when you look at the orders, the religious orders, the proportion of non-ordained religious order members who were alleged perpetrators make it clear that some of these orders should be shut down by the organised crime squads of our various state police forces. We're talking about organisations, orders within the Catholic Church, who are deeply criminal and clearly systemically criminal. Why aren't the New South Wales Police using their crime powers, their extended crime powers, to shut down the Brothers of St John of God, where 40.4% of the ordained members of the Brothers of St John of God are accused child abusers? 40.4%. Or the 22% of Christian brothers who are child abusers. 22%. 21.9% of the Salesians of Don Bosco, the 20.4% of Maris brothers, the 13.8% of De La Salle brothers, 12% of Patrician brothers. The list goes on. Why aren't we shutting down these orders as criminal organisations? Because that's what they are. This isn't some abstract discussion about children having the rough end of the stick. This is about criminal organisations that should be shut down. So of the 1,880 alleged perpetrators from within the Catholic Church, I said before that 597 were non-ordained religious brothers, 572 were priests, 543. Just think of these figures. These are the primarily men within the Catholic Church who have been alleged to abuse children. And let's be clear about it, that it's very, very unusual. If you look at the research and the literature, it's very, very unusual for these perpetrators of child abuse to just abuse one child. Because once they get away with it, and once they realise that even when the victims come and speak out, they won't be believed, which is the sad history, they don't just abuse one child, they abuse and abuse and abuse and abuse until they're put in jail. 543 were lay people, 96, only 5%, but 96 were non-ordained religious sisters, and 72 of known alleged perpetrators, their religious status was not known. So not only is this motion timely, but it is essential. And if I have to sit here and suffer through a contribution from the government or from any member who seeks to make excuses or seeks to suggest that the language is a bit rough and maybe we should make it more polite, or seek to suggest that we shouldn't be singling out one institution, I'm going to shut my ears to that contribution and remember the victims. And we should all do the same. I commend Mr Pearson for the motion. It should pass unanimously.
Further speakers?
Oh, sorry, Mr Deputy President.
Mr Shoebridge?
I leave.
Leave granted?
Yeah.
Leave granted.
And I thank the House. I move that the question be amended by inserting at the end a new point 3, which reads as follows: calls on the Australian Government to renounce the diplomatic protections afforded to the Catholic Church that have assisted the organisation to avoid producing to the Royal Commission materials on both the extent of child sexual abuse by members of the Church and the Church's systemic handling of child sexual abuse claims. And I thank the House for that leniency.